real politics means constant engagement and activism. That's what makes things happen.
So welcome to the program, Noam. It is wonderful to have you. Let me begin by asking how you're feeling at this moment, meaning what's your take on this election as far as how is it going for the various parties and people?
Well, this is an unusual election. I think in the voting, it's up for grabs, despite what the polls say. But there's another question hanging over it, which has never arisen in 350 years of parliamentary democracy in England, 250 years here. Will the incumbent refuse to be willing to leave office if he doesn't like the outcome of the election? He's already said he won't. That's never happened. We're already in uncharted territory. Trump has said if he doesn't like the way it comes out, he'll declare it to be fraudulent, illegitimate. Furthermore, there's what is called the Republican Party, which years ago used to be a genuine parliamentary party, but now has just become a gang of people sitting in the president's pocket, sycophants doing whatever he says. And the Republican Party has already began quite publicly organizing ways to undermine the electoral results by legalistic maneuvers of a variety of kinds if they don't like the way the outcome came out. So we're in a new situation.
So should people amongst the populace think their vote doesn't matter, if it could be stolen, if there could be what amounts to a coup, if the forces are ranked against them in the way that you describe? Why vote?
The vote does count. The greater the vote against Trump, the harder it will be to pull off these shenanigans. And we certainly don't give up. First of all, we don't know that this is going to happen. Secondly, we can prevent it from happening just by a substantial vote against Trump. Thirdly, even if it does happen, doesn't mean game over. That means you have to turn to other means of protesting the coup d'etat. So I think a lot of options are open.
So let's talk about that side of this equation. You have an essay in a book called Turnout, Mobilizing Voters in an Emergency. It's part of a longer collection that you have coming out later this year around universalizing resistance. Why is turnout so important to you today? And is it simply a matter of just turning out and casting a vote?
It's always far more important than elections. It's just that it's never been posed as an issue before. It was just, in the traditional left, just taken for granted, just understood forever that real politics means constant engagement and activism. That's what makes things happen. Now, in this particular moment, it happens to be of crucial importance because we're in a unique, unusual moment. But the turnout and the pressure is constant, no matter who's president, with one exception, this one.
We've seen one of the largest uprisings and most sort of interconnected movements of our times, the movement around Black lives and calling for a racial reckoning in this country. In the context of the COVID pandemic, those issues of bias and poverty and discrimination and violence and who gets what kind of care have been brought into sharp relief. That being the case, I would think you would be a bit more hopeful or optimistic about this election in this moment.
I would be if it were not for the unique phenomenon, unprecedented phenomenon of a malignant cancer in the White House. That happens to dominate the scene. Other than that, yes, you'd be right. The mobilizations after the George Floyd murder were without any precedent. The biggest social movement in American history developed very quickly. Now, it didn't just come from nowhere, it came from years of organizing and activism. Those are the things you don't see much when they're happening, but they're what laid the basis. After the assassination of George Floyd, they broke out with enormous popular support. About 2/3 of the population was supporting them. That's way more support than Martin Luther King got at the peak of his popularity. And that shows what regular, steadied activism can produce. Now, if it wasn't for the malignancy, which we have to get rid of, or we're in deep trouble, yes, it would be a very optimistic prospect. We could move forward on many fronts. The same is true, incidentally, even the Biden campaign. The DNC, the Democratic Party management, that's Clintonite, donor-oriented. They don't want any of this stuff. But they've been forced by popular activism to accept reluctantly a party program which is pretty progressive by the standards of the Democratic Party, very progressive, goes well beyond precedent. Why? Not because of religious conversion, because of the forces that have been mobilized. It's created a situation in which the Democratic Party managers, just like Reagan and Nixon, cannot refrain from offering at least something. And if their feet are held to the fire by continued activism, they'll have to deliver.
I have just two last questions. One has to do with what has often been called the great man theory of history, that there are individuals who turn the tide of history. And often that's counterposed to the sense of movements and trends and historic factors that create change. Which side of that are you on? And is this moment a kind of complexity of both?
Well, in this moment, there's a great man who happens to be a wrecker and has tremendous power behind him. Okay, so that's unique. It's not the great man theory of history. It's the great wrecker theory of history. Sometimes that happens. But putting that aside, take a look at the people we think of as great men who achieved something. There are such people. Like take Martin Luther King. He achieved a lot. Okay. How did he do it? I suppose Martin Luther King had gotten up out of nowhere and said, I have a dream, and so on. End of story. Martin Luther King was able to make that speech after years of work by people whose names nobody knows. I don't know, I suspect you don't know the names of the 4 Black kids who sat in at the segregated lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and were dragged off and jailed. Others came after them. All of this went on for years, many years. Finally, it got to the point where Martin Luther King could stand up with the I Have a Dream speech. You get Lyndon Johnson putting through some legislation. So is that a great man theory of history? Well, the fact that he did it was important. Probably nobody else like him was around who could have done it. But on the back of tremendous amounts of work, same with almost anything you can think of.
Mm.
One of my favorite lines from my old friend, the late Howard Zinn, was that history is made by countless unknown people who lay the basis for the events that finally occur. I think pretty much that's the way it works.
You've seen a lot of history. If I'm right, I think you're in your 90s at this point. And yet you've called this the most dangerous moment. I think the most dangerous moment that you've seen. Really?
It's the most dangerous moment in human history. We have to think what we're facing. We will overcome the pandemic at needless cost. We're not going to overcome the fact that the number of CO2 particles in the atmosphere is mounting very rapidly. That's fixed. We're not going to overcome the melting of the Arctic ice sheets. That's fixed. This goes on for another 10 or 20 years without any action on our part. We're toast. Continuing the current process, say to the end of this century, will lead, estimated, probably 7 degrees Fahrenheit or so above pre-industrial levels, which is total cataclysm. We're back to the period 125,000 years ago when the sea level was 25 feet higher than it is now. Just unthinkable. We have the answers. We know how to deal with it. We have a couple of decades to implement them. Either we do it or we don't. If we don't, the species is essentially finished. Most other species along with it. If we do it, we can have a much better society. That question has never arisen in human history, ever. And that's what we're facing now.
What does universalizing resistance then look like in this context?
Every threat that we face, pandemic, heating of the environment, they're all international. There are no borders. Universalizing resistance means working together with people in other countries facing the same problems to overcome the malicious forces that are driving us to disaster. And they're deep. A lot of them are just inherent in the system of production for profit. A lot of them are inherent in that. Others are affected by the twist that was given to this by the neoliberal programs of the last 40 years, which have been disastrous and are still being implemented. For example, in the way the CARES program is being administered, that are the way regulations to mitigate the effects of climate heating are being eliminated. So there's deep problems, there's immediate problems. We can deal with them. We can deal with them here, the most important country in the world, because of its power, but we're going to have to work with others everywhere.
Beautiful. Thank you. I think we've taken up enough of your time. I appreciate it. Wonderful to see you again.
Good to talk to you.